Okay, so just to get straight into it, the intro, the question that I posted, the topic was obviously what's in the name. This week's Parsha we read that Yaakov and the Malach of Esav had their momentous fight. Yaakov went back, obviously was on the way to Eretz Canaan and was about to meet Esav. He was crossing over the Jordan Valley, and on the way back, there's lots of different explanations. Midrashim, very interesting, that he went back to pick up a jar of olive oil. Some say the reason he went back for it was obviously because every single item of Yaakov contained tremendous holy sparks, and he didn't want to leave anything behind. Another medrash says that jar of olive oil was the anointing jar of oil that Shmuel Hanavi would use to anoint the various kings of Israel, as well as Mashiach, and therefore it was a very, very holy jar of oil. Regardless, he went back, and when he was over, he met the Malach of Esav, and there was a whole fight. I'm being very brief. There's a whole fight, and he kept the Malach of Esav all the way until sunrise, when it was the Malach of Esav's turn to sing Shir Hashem to Hashem, and the Malach said to Yaakov, "You have to let me go," and Yaakov says, "No, not until you give me a blessing." And he gave him a blessing of changing his name from Yaakov to Yisrael, and then he hit him in the thigh, which set in motion us not to get a nosha, the sciatic nerve in meat, and therefore effectively no more can we have any rump steak, effectively. Unless you're a Yemenite or Sephardi and know how to remove the sciatic nerve. Not a different subject. But what we see interesting is that Yaakov and Yisrael are interchangeable. Sometimes we are called Bnei Yaakov, sometimes we are called Bnei Yisrael. Sometimes Yaakov is called Yaakov, sometimes Yaakov is called Yisrael. And it changes through the whole Torah up until Yaakov passes away. Even with Bilam. Bilam also uses both names of Yaakov and Yisrael. When we look at another name change, another one of our forefathers also had a name change, and that was Avraham. Avraham was called Avram, and he had his name changed to Avraham. Except with Avraham, we don't see the same treatment as the Yaakov. With Avraham, he never went back to be called Avram. And the Talmud actually states that if you call Avram, you are breaking a biblical prohibition. Why? What's the difference between Avraham's name being called Avraham and not going back to Avram, and Yaakov's name can be interchangeable between Yaakov and Yisrael? So a simple explanation is that Avraham has the additional name Hey. So beforehand he was called Avram, which means the exalted father, or the father who's the exalted one. And after that he becomes Avram with a Hey, Avraham, which means the exalted father of the multitude. But more specifically, he has the Avram's name had the additional Hey. And generally we know the Hey is associated with the creative element of godliness, of God. You have Yud Kei Vav Kei, God's four-letter name, which creates L'mayla Mistashrus, above infinity, and the creation that goes above Tamadas, logical and rational reasoning. Then you have Elokeinu, which is the name of God, which creates nature and the false image, or the not so false image, the superficial image that we see around us. So Avraham had that Hey in his name, giving him a far more exalted status than he was originally called Avram. And therefore, if you call him Avram, you're diminishing his status. Fine. Yisrael and Yaakov is two separate names. Yaakov is Yaakov and Yisrael is Yisrael. Yes, Yisrael seems to be a higher name, but it's a separate name. So therefore, the Torah has no problem calling one, sometimes Yaakov, sometimes calling Yisrael, Yisrael, sometimes calling us Bnei Yisrael, sometimes calling us Bnei Yaakov. Fine. One explanation. But you still have to ask, what's the difference between Yaakov and Yisrael? Why are sometimes we are called Yaakov, and Bnei Yaakov, or Yaakov is called Yaakov, and sometimes it's called Yisrael? And especially in this particular point, with the whole story of the Malach the Malach of Esav and Yaakov and the fight, his name is changed to Yisrael, but shortly after that he's called Yaakov again. And then after that it's called Yisrael. What is the name Yisrael and Yaakov symbolizing? The Yaakov and Yisrael both have, obviously we know that generally a name has symbolic meaning, also contains what we call the koyach, the potential of the individual on a micro level. So obviously the name Yaakov and Yisrael also does the same. Yaakov has a potential, a koyach, a power, and so does Yisrael. And depending upon what the scenario is, we are therefore called Yaakov and Yisrael, depending upon what's happening and what power we are hoping to tap into or needing to get from that name. So what's the difference? I'm not just going to leave it there. What's the actual koyach? What's the actual potential power that we get from it? So Yaakov has something that Yisrael doesn't have, and Yisrael has something Yaakov doesn't have. What does Yaakov have? So we know generally that Yaakov actually has several different meanings, both not so complementary. One is he's called Yaakov because Akev, when he was born, he was meant to be the first twin, and what happened is that Esav pulled him back in, and Esav came out instead, and therefore he was called Akev. He grabbed him by the heel. That's one meaning. Esav used the same terminology in a later point for a very different meaning, and that is referring to him as duplicit. Yeah, duplicit. When Yaakov stole the birthright from Esav. And Esav says, now I understand why he's called Yaakov, because he's a liar. He's duplicit. He does things which are dishonest. So the name Yaakov has. The name Yaakov has. Don't worry. It's right at the bank. The name Yisrael therefore has another meaning, which is Sarakel. Well, it has several meanings, but according to one explanation, Sarakel is a godly officer or a divine officer or a divine master, and has a very, very different connotation. Generally, when Yaakov was called Yaakov was during periods of strife in his life. When he was in the house of Lavan, he was called Yaakov. When there were various issues in his house, and when there was times of trouble and obstacles and challenges, he was called Yaakov. During times that were peaceful and that were happy, and he was growing, and things were pleasant, then he was called Yisrael. So to the Jewish people, during times that we were going through strife and there were issues, one of them was when Bilam was cursing us, we were called Bnei Yaakov. But there were times when we were going to be growing and developing, and Bilam interchanged the two names. At one point he calls us Bnei Yaakov, but when he's praising us in another way, he calls us Bnei Yisrael. So obviously Yaakov seems to be associated with a negative time of strife, and Yisrael is associated with a time of positivity and building and growth. How? So because Yaakov's name means heel or duplicit, that's the right word, implies that basically there are times when, both with Yaakov but also with ourselves, we are dealing with what we call the Akev, the very heel, the very mundane or the very superficial level of reality, where we are continuously faced with the duplicit reality, where everything around us is not what it seems. And therefore we are dealing with the most mundane, the most spiritually removed. And I don't just mean now in this era. I mean, generally when you go to work, when you're busy in life and things, you're dealing with things which usually are very mundane. Going shopping, driving from A to B. They're not particularly holy or spiritual. They are the Akev. But many times it's also in order to interact with the world around us, when we have to be at work, so to speak, or we have to, in our lives, we have to change ourselves. We can't necessarily always be the true individual we are. Not everyone appreciates honesty in its simple form. Sometimes people are like, hey, I prefer a fake person. I don't want you to tell me the truth. So also, Yaakov, the name, you have to change the way we operate. That we're not necessarily going to be holy. Maybe just leave it if it keeps switching off. There are times when we just have to change the way we operate. I don't mean necessarily lie. There's times when we can't necessarily be the open, honest individuals in order to bring about a greater sense of spirituality around us. And that's the Akev mentality, or the Yaakov mentality. But there are also times when we are a Yisrael mentality, when things are going well, when we're in a spiritual high, and on a daily basis, you're a Yaakov. You could be an individual is a Yaakov Jew when he's at work, but when he's in shul, when he's davening, he's a Yisrael Jew. Things are going positive. It's in a spiritual environment. Yaakov and Yisrael are two different types of individuals inside of us. I don't mean to say we're schizophrenic, or we're not to make fun of any mental health issues, but that's not to say that we have to be one or the other. We are both. But there are times when we are Yisrael, and there are times when we are Yaakov. And by the fact that the Torah interchanges Yaakov and Yisrael one to the other throughout the whole Torah, implies that there is no time that you can be one without the other. There are times that you're going to be Yisrael, but you need to know that you also have to return back to being a Yaakov. You can't always be on a spiritual high. you also have to go down to the Akev. You have to go down to the lowest points and work with it. Sometimes not necessarily in a spiritual way. Sometimes you have to really cover over and conceal your own spiritual heights, and deal on that level with whatever you're dealing with. Deal with the deal with the lowest on their level, so to speak. And because you have those two back and forths, the Yaakov and Yisrael, we see that what did Avraham represent? There's a concept of rotz v'shul, the dynamic versus static. So Avraham wasn't dynamic; he was static. He reached a high level, Avraham, a very, very high level, and that's where he remained. Obviously, that's not to say he was a static individual. I'm not implying that, but his level of holiness wasn't going back and forth, dealing with the very, very lowest.